Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing cloud computing. More to the point, we're going to be discussing dedicated servers, cloud processing, and a lot more besides. This is going to be a two-part series. This first part is going to be focusing on giving a brief overview of cloud computing and also the negatives of cloud computing. In the second part, which of course will be up in a couple of days' time, we're going to be doing the opposite. We're going to be actually focusing on the positives. Now, I'm going to be doing this video series because several people have messaged me, and there seems to be some confusion on the whole cloud computing situation. And this has been further exacerbated because Microsoft have recently started to, of course, the process of closing games for Windows Live. And you've also got various other developer commentary and other bits and pieces as well that's been floating around the internet. And so there's a beehive of activity, really. And I figure the best way to tackle this fairly is to do it as two separate videos. One focusing completely on the negatives. So, yeah, there's not going to be anything really positive said about that cloud computing apart from how it works in this video. And the next part is going to be focusing mostly on the positives. So, in other words, negatives and positives to give a balanced opinion. Now, before we get too started, I'm going to give the brief overview on how this works. I'm going to assume many of you know about cloud computing, cloud processing to a certain degree. If you're not sure about what it is, specifically Windows Azure, and how instances are run, how servers set up. What you can do is, by all means, you could do your own independent research, or I've already released a video on this channel, so you can search for something like Azure, and it should pop up. That's Azure, and there should be a video that pops up, and you can actually check that out, and it will show you how servers are set up, how instances are set up, and various other bits and pieces. I'll probably do a second part to that as well, because there's some aspects of it that I still need to go into regarding the server. But regardless, that'll give you a good overview of how things work. So what I am going to do right now is give you a quick catch-up, if you will. So it refreshes people and just gives you a brief understanding of it. But if you do want more in-depth, then you can check out the other video. So, while I'm sure many of you are familiar with the principles behind cloud computing, the ideas are pretty simple. There are multiple functions for cloud, and a lot of people get them really mixed up. One of them, for example, is cloud saves. And that's pretty simple. Your saved data is uploaded either locally, but most likely it will be stored locally and on the cloud. So that allows some consistency. So let's assume, for example, you uninstall the game, your PC crashes, you go to someone else's house, whatever, then there's some consistency there. In other words, you will be able to continue pretty much right where you left off. The save will download diligently onto your local machine, and Bob's your uncle. The next is cloud servers. So, for example, multiplayer aspects. Typically, back in the day, if you guys are familiar with online gaming, especially on the PC, you'll know that there's a couple of ways that games could really be hosted. One would be a local machine. So, in other words, let's assume we'll go back in the dawns of time and we'll talk about, say, I don't know, Quake 3, or even a little bit more recent, let's say Counter-Strike, because more people have probably played that than what they have Quake 3, at least recently anyway. And you'll know there's a couple of things you can do. One, you can set up your own machine, your own local server. So, in other words, if people know your IP address or whatever, you can have your friends log in, assuming you enable it on your local machine, security-wise and so on. And people could just basically play on your server. Now, this does give you a noticeable advantage. It's called host advantage. Why? Because other people don't have, you don't have any latency. So in other words, you're walking around with 0 ms lag, 0 millisecond lag, and they have some latency issues, which isn't too much of a problem in some cases, but in other games it can be a real bitch. Especially back in the days when internet connections were considerably worse than what they are now. There are problems with this, of course. One, for example, let's assume that you're the host and you decide to, I don't know, log out, like your computer crashes, you know, end the game, whatever, then most likely people are going to be thrown off. And so what typically happens is people, of course, rent servers. And now it's getting to the point where virtual servers are much more efficient, effective. You could basically spin up a server, create a server that pretty much matches your needs, whatever that is. So, for example, a 20-man server, a 15-man server, or whatever. And you just simply rent that out. And then there's cloud processing. So this one's pretty simple. The idea, and this is what Microsoft are primarily touting, this is basically that let's assume that you have various visual effects or computing effects, and you don't feel that they are well suited to the console. Let's assume that there's a hell of a lot of physics, for example, or a lot of textures, or a lot of background AI, or whatever. Therefore, you can, in theory, offload that to cloud, and the cloud, you know, some server somewhere, most likely the one closest to you because of their network. In other words, it won't pick one that's like, you know, in Australia if you're in, say, America or the UK, because obviously that's a pretty big distance. You're going to get latency issues. So what will happen is their network will target the server closest to you. So for example, let's say you're in the United Kingdom, it could be that you get a server say in London, so it doesn't matter where you are in the UK. It could be you are in, you know, one end of the country which is really far away from London, but it just happens geographically that London is the closest proximity in terms of the server location, and that's typically how it will go. Obviously, it's not 100% accurate all the time because it is working primarily off of your IP address based upon your server location, but typically it's the best option. This generally goes into CDN as well, which is a content delivery network. This is pretty simple as well. Content, so for example, let's say game purchases. So for example, additional levels or patches or movies, if you say decide to rent them or stream them or whatever, they will be copied over to multiple data centers. They'll upload them to one, and then that's distributed onto their network, and then that'll be quickly streamed around the net. So hopefully that gives you a brief overview of how this stuff works. So as I said, the first part we're going to be focusing on why I dislike some of this stuff, and there's actually not one singular reason. There's actually a plethora, a multitude of different reasons, I tell you. That's not to say that there aren't any positives, and once again we're going to go into those in the next video, because I don't want to seem like, you know, I'm bashing Microsoft or whatever. Some of this is going to sound pretty anti-Microsoft, but then some of it's going to sound pretty anti-cloud in general. And it can sound like, you know, you're a bit of a stickler, because Microsoft and others have said, well, the future is the cloud. The future, you know, is being able to easily distribute, you know, data really simply and easily, and consistency, and it you know, gives you a consistent experience. One reason I dislike this is, well, internet connection. Now, I know what you're going to say. You know, internet connections are getting a hell of a lot better. For example, Virgin Media, which is one of the primary ISPs in the United Kingdom, so internet service provider, is going to be offering like 1 gigabit connections. So I'm on 120 megabytes currently. So basically you're looking at like 10 times that, and this is apparently going to be available like 2015/16. So in other words, just a couple of years. And that sounds really great on paper, but the problem is, right now there's 120 megabit connections available. Your mileage may vary, but first of all, if you're in a geographic location which just sucks for internet, then you're not going to have that. Now, obviously the UK is not really the same as, say, the United States, because, well, you guys are a hell of a lot bigger than the UK. Therefore, it's a lot easier to just simply lay down the cables, where it's not so easy in the United States, and that's one of the issues with rural areas in the United States in terms of internet. Not that, the rural areas look bad or anything in the United States, actually they're pretty gorgeous. But for internet-wise and for, the ability to quickly roll out new infrastructure changes, it's not that easy. But let's even give them that this isn't the case. Let's even give them that it's fairly easy to roll out these changes. Well, there's still a couple of issues. Now, we know that Games for Windows Live is ending on PC, and Microsoft assure us that they are working on something, as are Capcom, for example, for the Street Fighter titles and other games which rely on Games for Windows Live. Now, if you're not a PC gamer, I'm going to quickly explain this. Basically, the premise is that Games for Windows Live acts as authentication. As you guys may be aware, you simply buy the game and it will authenticate it so that, well, in theory, you're playing a legitimate copy of the game. So, what happens when Games for Windows Live closes? Well, certain games, it matters very little. So what they could basically do is, let's assume that you have a legit version of the game, you may be able to re-register it on Steam, assuming you've not already got it. Other titles, for example, Batman Arkham Origins, will quite happily be not using a Games for Windows Live, and I've never really liked Games for Windows Live, ever. And there are multiple reasons behind it. Mostly, I really hate the UI and user experience. I felt it was clunky and clumsy and not very intuitive. And honestly speaking, I had so many activation issues with titles. I'm talking massive issues on a DLC that I bought on, for example, Batman Arkham City. It was ridiculous. I remember it not being a singular issue. In other words, it just wasn't me being a retard. It was actually quite a big issue, and quite a few people were affected by it, and it was pretty consistent. And I just didn't really like it that much. And certain games, for example, Dark Souls, as I said, and Test Drive, and a couple of other games do use it. A lot of Capcom games do, but they're not going to be for the next Street Fighter. But let's say, for example, that they release a patch for, say, let's go and pick on Dark Souls. The developers could do a couple of options. One, they could just release a patch which completely removes the need to worry about activation. So, in other words, the patch will basically render the game completely copyable. So, in other words, you can just basically copy and paste it, and you can install it onto a trillion different machines, whatever. Obviously, that's not exactly an ideal option, but I suppose it could be an option. The other way is for titles, for example, let's say you've bought it through Steam. Well, in that case, Steam becomes the activation window. But the problem with all of this, and you can imagine what I'm just about to say, can't you? Yeah. Capcom, whatever, Bethesda, whomever created the game, well, yeah, they actually need to divert their money to actually do this. And let's talk about a game which actually uses the Games for Windows Live service. What happens then? Well, basically you can't play it anymore. You can't play it online. It's simple. It's just going to die. Which is not too bad if the game only offers, say, leaderboards for its online, in other words, oh look, I'm beating, Bob here on the leaderboard. That's a bit annoying, but it's not exactly going to make you care. On the other hand, if it's something like, Age of Empires Online, it'd be kind of nice if you actually had the online service, wouldn't it? So, I know what you're going to say. Well, firstly, that's, PC, and we're talking about consoles, and secondly, Steam. And I completely concur with you. However, there are a couple of points to note. Firstly, the basic premise behind dedicated servers, for example, on consoles, dedicated servers or cloud computing, is that they are basically offloading a certain percentage of the work. So, for example, let's talk about Forza. And you may remember that they're basically saying that, AI is a lot smarter, and blah 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 because of the cloud. The thing is, how long are they going to be able to maintain those servers? This is a really arguable point, because we've talked about persistent game worlds before, and I really love the idea. I really love the idea of, the Titanfall developers, for example, have discussed about the dedicated servers and, how awesome they are and whatever. But let's assume that you develop a game for the Xbox or whatever console. How long are you going to continuously pour money into running those servers? You want an example of this? Okay. One example would be Tekken Tag Tournament 2, which is available on the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. Basically, it didn't sell as well as what they hoped, and the game hasn't been as popular as what they hoped, although, of course, this is somewhat arguable and blah blah blah. And so they're going to be, according to the news anyway, shutting down what is known as the World Tekken Federation service. It's going to end basically this September, this year, of course. And the WTF, which is ironic naming, if ever I've heard it, because it's so heavily integrated with the console version of the title, some of the online features of the game are going to, stop working. For example, replay searching is going to go bye-bye. Ghost downloading, team creation, and web access of World Tekken website will also go down. We all remember the times when, for example, Microsoft was shutting down servers in regards to Halo 2 and other situations as well. In other words, how long can a company realistically host a server? Because Microsoft isn't going to be, the ones that are paying basically for the bandwidth, let's say, for a game like Tekken. It's not fair for Microsoft to do that. But the problem is, when you're basically relying on cloud computing, it comes to a point where there has to be a cut-off period. You can't realistically expect for a $40 game to forever and a day continuously support that feature. It's different on a game like World of Warcraft, right? A game like World of Warcraft, sure, you know that your monthly subscription, as long as the game is making Blizzard enough money, let's say it's even got 1 million subscribers, Blizzard aren't going to close down WoW. Sure, the patches will become less frequent or whatever, but they're still going to keep the servers running for a certain period of time. They might start to do some server migration, or maybe some combining of servers. So, for example, let's say 2 low population servers, they'll merge them to one, but still. The same goes for Steam as well. Like, one of the arguments as well, Steam very similar. If your Steam account goes down or Steam dies, well, the figure is, it's very unlikely, because Steam are basically just acting as an authentication service. So sure, it's possible, but I don't know why, but I just feel that it's a lot less possible. And that's one of the reasons I don't like the dedicated server aspect of it. So what about the actual cloud computing aspect of it? Something like, the AI, for example, in, let's say, Forza. So this is another argument. So there are some benefits to this, in that it does offload some of the strain from the CPU, and that's good. The problem is, a lot of people seem to be focused on the fact that, the cloud is going to be this immense resource, and this is what Microsoft are really advertising it to be, and a couple of other companies are doing the same, to be fair, and it does have its uses, but there is a reason that Mark Cerny and his team didn't pursue cloud processing on the PlayStation, because you can't really get it to process graphics on the fly. Even if you have a really fast internet connection, there are things known as latency. Where traffic basically gets a hold up, or your internet connection, drops just for a second, especially as people are now using wireless, of course. you could have instances where, for example, your friend's downloading something on the connection, let's say, and it messes up, or dozens of different issues. And even if not, there's still a latency. Basically speaking, the latency between an internet connection, no matter how fast, is a hell of a lot more than, say, a CPU registrar or even local system memory. Yeah. And so you have Microsoft really keenly pushing the fact that, this is going to allow us to create much richer environments and so on. But the thing is, we know that simply because things have to sync to every frame, it's not really going to be this magical land of what they're really focused on. Sure, in some aspects, it does have some advantages, and we've discussed those previously in other videos, but obviously I will be focusing on this in a separate video to kind of give you all my thoughts in one easy to access pile, if you will. But obvious ones include AI, especially for background characters, persistent game worlds. But once again, you've still got questions raised of, well, how easy is it for them to continue to maintain that in the case of a single player game? And then you've got other issues. Another issue that I have with this whole cloud implementation, especially Microsoft's version, I don't necessarily know how many developers are going to utilize it properly. Allow me to illustrate this further. Let's say that you are a developer that is working on a cross-platform game. You can be Capcom, you can be an indie developer, you can be Bethesda, take your pick. I'm just going to use the word Bethesda, right? But it doesn't really have to be that, but it's just easy to work with a singular name. So let's say you're Bethesda, and let's say you're making Fallout 4, okay? Sounds popular, sounds great, right? It's not an online game, so we have that removed. It is instead a single-player title, and that that your artistic vision is that you want a certain story level unfolding, you want a certain level of characters, you want this, you want that, you know how to go about it, great. Now, there are a couple of points. Firstly, are you going to spend the resources, the finite resources you have? And that's the important thing. It's okay to say, well, all we have to do is, you just get a couple of people extra working. Well, it's not that simple. Firstly, they need to port the code anyway. Let's assume that your lead development platform is a PC. Most next generation designers right now seem to be using the PC as the lead platform because it's pretty easy to program on. You've got really good C++ libraries, which both consoles utilize heavily. Microsoft, of course, uses a lot of C#, but that's beside the point. It's really easy to port a lot of this stuff over. You've got great support for DirectX 11, and of course, well, the Xbox uses DirectX 11. The PlayStation 4 uses an API that's really similar to DirectX. At least the high level, low level stuff you can program and get better performance, and you can sort of do that for the Xbox anyway, at least it's getting better. So you've still got to basically produce 3 different copies of the game, and some developers have said it's a lot easier, but a lot easier is not to say that it's just like copy and paste. In other words, there's some still significant differences between the two machines. So let's assume that you have this situation where you've got dedicated cloud processing. One argument from people is that it does allow to build much more persistent game worlds, blah blah blah. The thing is, how many of those titles are really going to focus on it, at least to a degree that actually matters? This is one of those situations where are we just going to get the token ad so that, for example, Microsoft paid them a bit of cash and they said, well, you know what, if you could add a bit, just to kind of, for marketing purposes, yeah. But we're talking about meaningful changes because for start, they have to actually make it so it's actually worth sales. In other words, the cost of additions are worth it for that title. And it depends, of course, how much money it costs for them to actually implement those changes. And let's assume that it is worth it. Well, then you've got other issues such as, well, if it requires dedicated service, how long are those companies going to realistically maintain those servers? I'm not saying that cloud doesn't have its uses. I'm saying that there are a lot of negatives that I have with the cloud. And it really comes down to little issues like, for example, Mark Cerny has said categorically that he doesn't think it's a good thing to have cloud processing in terms of graphics and so on the local system. Now, there's a couple of points to bear in mind. You could always say that Mark himself is very biased, and I would agree. He's not going to say, well, gee whiz, it could work. He's going to obviously be fairly negative on it. However, he has said that the PlayStation could support it. Now, we've only got his word on that. That's the important thing to know. But for what it seems, yes, it seems like the PlayStation 4, if they did want it to, and I have no real, I have no real cause to actually doubt them. That's put that way. He doesn't believe that basically cloud computing is going to be a thing, because obviously you've got that huge discrepancy. You've got the stuff that's processed locally, and you've got the stuff that's processed on the cloud and then sent to you. And it's not that the cloud is slow, right? Like, their servers, the servers that are actually rendering the stuff, are really fast, really powerful. They're going to be like really high end, and basically you are allocated a certain reserve in the cloud, right? So it could be that, let's say your name's Tom. It could be that basically that their servers don't even have you any space allocated. Basically, you're just like this instance that doesn't exist until you switch your console on, and then, well, basically, the resources you're given will drastically increase to be able to support your console. The purpose behind this is quite simple, obviously, to reduce costs. There's no point having these resources being utilized by nothing and still running. So there are so many different caveats here, but it's not like Sony have huge cloud expertise themselves. They have gone with, of course, pioneering the Gaikai technology, and the reason behind that is pretty simple. The PlayStation 4 is an x86, 64, x86 64, there we go, I can speak some English, system, and it doesn't have enough power to basically emulate, at least locally, the titles from the PlayStation 3. That's just a fact. It could do it if the processor was a lot faster, but it's just simply not fast enough to basically emulate PowerPC architecture. Ironically enough, for example, the Xbox One could pretty easily emulate the Xbox original Xbox games. So we're talking like, the 2001 or whatever it was Xbox. It could emulate that, but it couldn't really emulate Xbox 360. So you've got this situation where Sony really needed to start pushing forward in terms of the Gaikai technology, because you've obviously going to get a hell of a lot of people are bitching if you can't play, your PlayStation 3 titles on the PlayStation 4. Obviously, it's not an ideal way, I'm sure you'll agree, but it is a way. The other way, of course, is they could have placed some of the technology, basically the cell processor and blah blah blah, inside the PS4, but it obviously would have the negative effect of drastically increasing the cost and probably the size and probably the chance of the machine going wrong as well. So you've got this situation where they basically have contacted Rackspace, and Rackspace are one of the big companies out there. There's also, of course, Microsoft with Windows Azure. You've got Rackspace and Open Cloud sort of software, and they basically are pioneering some technology along with NASA. And then you've got some other companies such as Amazon. They do AWS or Amazon Web Services, and they all do about things very similar, but there's some slight differences in terms of their service offered. But for the most part, there's quite a lot of crossover. So they're using that technology, and the reason behind that, of course, is to be able to better distribute their content. So, for example, Gaikai technology, of course, is going to be game streaming, which is basically very different from what we've discussed here so far. Cloud streaming, of course, is pretty simple. It's almost like having a controller of a really, really, really long extension cord. In other words, you're basically playing the games over the internet. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the prospect anyway. And that's pretty much as good as it gets. I'm not 100% convinced, if I'm honest with this. I think certain games it's going to work well. I think certain games, for example, the Final Fantasies of the world, that type of thing, I think it could go quite well, but I think it's still going to be pretty latency sensitive on games which require basically moves to be synced to certain frames. For example, fighting games. I don't know how convinced I am with that, but we'll have to see. Another purpose, of course, would be the actual distribution of cloud saves and so on. I actually quite like the idea of cloud saves. Why? Because it doesn't negatively impact me. As long as the game saves locally, and pretty much any game does now, let's assume, for example, that Bethesda, have local and non-local saves. So, in other words, it saves to your Xbox and also backs up to the cloud. And let's assume, for whatever reason, it can't do that. Let's say the cloud's gone because your internet connection dies. It doesn't really matter. Insert whatever apocalyptic ideas you want. It doesn't matter too much because, well, quite simply put, the local version is still going to be there. It's not a prerequisite. You're not losing anything for that save not being there. You've just lost the backup. But on the plus side, at least you've still got the main copy. This is really completely contrary, however, to cloud processing. If cloud processing or a cloud dedicated server dies, then you've got some issues there. So, I think that's just about it on the negatives. There are some other bits and bobs I'd like to discuss, but I think I've gone through the primary concerns that I have. The next video, which as I said is going to be up in a day or two, is going to focus on the positives, because there are some positives as well, despite the fact that I've basically just gone on like 30 odd minutes blasting the thing to bits. There are some aspects of it I do like, and as I said, we're going to cover those in a different video. So, hopefully you've enjoyed it. I'm going to let my ranty self go and do some other bits and bobs that I need to do, unfortunately. So hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.